young boy vanished without a trace during a local baseball game. No one saw him leave, and every search led nowhere. But 9 months later, his father opens a coach's cooler, and what he finds inside leaves him speechless. Dan Hartman watched silently as the printer spat out yet another flyer, his son Robbie's smiling face staring back at him from the glossy sheet. 12 years old, full of energy, wearing his favorite cap, and missing for 270 days. The weak morning sun poured through the dusty windows of Mike Lacier's garage, casting long shadows that made everything feel colder. "Maybe we hit the east side of the forest today," Mike suggested, snapping Dan out of his thoughts. "There's a ravine a few miles in, thick brush, hard to get through, but if someone wanted to hide..." Mike wasn't just Robbie's coach. He was Dan's closest friend, and the one person who never gave up. A former NYPD officer, now a local carpenter, Mike had been the backbone of every search, long after others moved on. "You really think it's worth checking?" Dan asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't," Mike replied, serious as ever. "We'll need the gear, though. It's not an easy hike." Dan nodded, collecting the newest flyer from the tray. Same photo, same text. Missing, Robert Robbie Hartman. Last seen, Gardner Ballfield. And still, no answers. "It's like he vanished into thin air," Dan murmured. "We're going to find him," Mike said, placing a hand on Dan's shoulder. "I promised you that." In the early weeks, the entire town of Gardner, New York, rallied behind Dan. Search teams, news coverage, flyers taped to every storefront. But as time dragged on and leads dried up, sympathy turned into silence. Some parents pulled their kids from the league. Others crossed the street to avoid Dan. Even the local police eventually stepped back, their last words still echoing in Dan's head. "We'll keep the file open." Only Mike stayed. "I'll go grab the backpacks," he said now, heading inside. "We'll need water, tools, usual stuff. It'll be a long day." As the door shut behind him, Dan's thoughts turned to Mike. After a heart procedure forced him off the force, Mike had moved to Gardner for a quieter life. His wife had supported the change, but tragedy struck during her trip abroad. She contracted a rare illness and passed suddenly, leaving Mike to raise their daughter Millie alone. A sharp squeak broke the silence. The printer jammed again. Dan sighed and opened the hood, carefully removing the crumpled paper. Probably just needed a little oil. He glanced around the garage and walked to Mike's workbench to look for WD-40. Opening the second drawer, something caught his eye beneath the tools. A red and navy baseball cap. He picked it up slowly. The bold red B on the front stood out. Brookside Braves, a neighboring town's team. The same team Robbie had idolized. The same cap he wore the day he disappeared. Dan was still holding it when Mike returned, arms full of gear. "Found this in your drawer," Dan said, lifting the cap. "Didn't know you were a Braves fan." Mike hesitated just a beat before grinning. "A man can root for two teams, can't he? Ridge Runners are my team, but I've always liked the Braves too." "Robbie loved them," Dan said quietly. "Saved for 3 months just to buy that hat." "Kids around here wear those all the time," Mike replied, casually loading the trunk. "You know how it is. Local pride." Dan nodded and placed the cap back in the drawer. "I was looking for WD-40. Printer jammed. Top shelf, left side," Mike said, pointing. Dan sprayed the rollers, cleared the jam, and got the flyers printing again. As the final sheets stacked up, he wondered, was this all just routine now? 9 months. It didn't feel like hope anymore. But stopping meant accepting Robbie was gone, and Dan wasn't ready for that. He couldn't be. He placed the finished flyers in the back seat of Mike's SUV and climbed in beside him. As they pulled away from the neighborhood and into the tree-lined outskirts of Gardner, silence settled between them, until Dan spoke. "You know what I can't stop thinking about?" he said quietly. That last game Robbie played, like he was born for it. Mike nodded without taking his eyes off the road. He was on fire that day, best I've seen him play. Thought his asthma might slow him down, but he powered through. Dan smiled faintly, remembering it all. The crack of the bat, the grin on Robbie's face, the way the whole field had cheered. That was the last time anyone saw him, and now they were heading back into the woods, again, to chase a thread of hope through the silence. There was a hint of sadness in Dan's voice as he recalled that final game. He couldn't stop talking about the double he hit in the fourth inning. That kid had the cleanest swing I've ever seen, Mike said before quickly correcting himself. He has the cleanest swing. The shift to present tense didn't go unnoticed, and Dan appreciated it more than words could say. It meant Mike hadn't given up either. I just don't get it, Dan murmured, voicing the thought that had haunted him every day for the past 9 months. One second he was walking to the locker room, and the next, I was packing up equipment by my car, Mike said quietly. Didn't see a thing. The road narrowed as they drove deeper into the countryside, the trees growing taller, the gaps between houses longer. The silence between them grew more reflective, more personal. I don't know what I would have done without you, Dan said, turning slightly toward Mike. Everyone else walked away, even the police. Mike kept his eyes on the road. Don't put me on a pedestal, Dan. If I were that good, we'd have found him by now. He hesitated, then added, but I'll say this. I respect the hell out of you for not breaking. Most would have. I can't break, Dan replied simply. He's my son. They fell silent again, each lost in his own thoughts, until the scenery outside changed from sparse buildings to dense forest, untouched, wild, and still full of unanswered questions. This wasn't a place they had searched before. It was farther from the field, but still within the original radius the police had mapped out. Dan glanced at Mike. Your heart holding up okay? Yeah, Mike replied. Stent's doing its job. Doc says I'm all set, as long as I take it easy. Dan arched a brow, gesturing toward the woods ahead. And this is your idea of easy? Mike chuckled. Compared to chasing suspects through Brooklyn, this is nothing. They slowed as a gas station came into view at the edge of the preserve. I'm gonna top off the tank, Mike said. We should grab food and drinks too. It'll be a long day. Dan nodded. Mike had always been the planner, especially when it came to hydration. After every game, he'd have a cooler filled with cold drinks waiting for the team. Little things like that made him a favorite with the kids. After fueling up, they walked into the small convenience store. Dan grabbed sandwiches, trail mix, and energy bars, while Mike picked out canned coffee and a few sodas. Back at the SUV, Mike popped open the trunk and reached for the old blue cooler he'd used for years. Scratched, faded, but reliable. You still use that old thing? Dan asked with a half smile. Mike shrugged. If it works, why change it? Dan helped load the food while Mike tossed in the drinks, then snapped the lid shut. That cooler was as much a part of Mike as his coaching clipboard or his woodshop apron, a fixture that never seemed out of place. As they climbed back in and headed toward the trail entrance, Dan felt something flicker deep inside him. Maybe it was hope. Maybe this day would be different. Or maybe it would end like all the others, empty-handed and exhausted, with nothing to show but a little more wear on their faces. He forced the thought away. He couldn't let doubt win. Not now, not ever. The SUV tires crunched over gravel as they pulled into the parking area near the forest entrance. A simple wooden sign marked hiking trail pointed toward a narrow path vanishing into the trees. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine. This is it, Mike said as he turned off the ignition. East entrance. We haven't tried this section yet. They got out and began unloading their gear. Dan took his backpack and the stack of flyers, while Mike sorted their equipment. The forest stood before them, quiet, vast, and unknown. "I'm gonna grab a drink real quick," Dan said, walking to the trunk where the cooler sat. He flipped open the lid, reached past the soda bottles, and searched for his canned coffee. But what his fingers touched wasn't a drink. It was something small and plastic, smooth, familiar. Dan pulled it out. It was an inhaler, a standard blue-capped albuterol inhaler, identical to the one Robbie used. Dan froze. "Mike," he called, holding it up. "You have asthma?" Mike turned, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, a flash of something Dan couldn't quite name. Surprise, confusion, maybe even fear. And for the first time in all these months, Dan saw something in Mike that didn't quite fit. "Oh, that," Mike said, finally walking over. "It's Millie's. She was diagnosed just last month." Dan frowned, turning the small inhaler over in his hand. "Really? I didn't know. That's rough." "I found it in the cooler," he added, his voice neutral. "Yeah, well, kids these days," Mike said with a shrug, reaching for it. "We don't even live in the city with all the smog, and still, asthma." Dan handed it over, but hesitated as Mike began placing it back inside the cooler. "You know, Mike," he said, "I don't think it's a great idea to keep it chilled. The cold can make the medicine less effective over time." Mike paused for a beat. "Right. Good point. I didn't realize. Millie just says it feels better cold. She's like my grandma that way. Always kept things in the fridge. I usually don't leave it in there long, but I must have forgotten yesterday." Dan gave a slow nod. The explanation made sense on the surface. Still, he couldn't help but wonder, wouldn't the doctor have explained how to store it? He pushed the doubt aside. Maybe it wasn't important. "Just looking out for Millie," he said quietly, closing the cooler and cracking open his coffee. Mike slipped the inhaler into his pocket, then turned back to the trunk and pulled something else out, a handgun. He checked the magazine, then looked over at Dan. "We should probably bring this, just in case. Bears, coyotes, you never know." Dan raised a brow. "We've been out here a dozen times and never brought a weapon." Before he could say more, a uniformed park ranger emerged from a nearby trail and immediately spotted the firearm. "Excuse me, sir," the ranger said, eyes narrowing. "No firearms are permitted inside the forest park." Mike moved calmly, tucking the weapon back into its case. "Totally understand, officer. I'm a retired NYPD detective. Force of habit." He pulled out a worn ID wallet and handed it over. The ranger studied it, then nodded. "I get it, but we've still got to enforce the rules. That'll need to stay locked in your vehicle." "Of course," Mike said quickly. "My mistake." The ranger gave them a final look before continuing on his patrol. Dan noticed Mike's shoulders stayed tense long after the ranger was gone. "Since when do you carry a gun out here?" Dan asked, voice low. Mike shrugged, placing the case in the trunk and locking it. "Just felt like being extra cautious. I heard about recent bear sightings in this area, but it's staying here, no worries." Dan took a long sip of his coffee, studying his friend. Something felt off. Mike had always been the steady one, unshakable, but today he seemed distracted, nervous. "You good?" Dan asked. "You seem a little jumpy." "I'm fine," Mike answered quickly. "Just want to get started. We're losing light." Dan nodded, though the unease lingered. They gathered their gear, grabbed their walking sticks, and set out on the trail. But Dan couldn't shake the small details piling up in his mind. The inhaler, the gun, the tension in Mike's voice. Maybe they meant nothing, or maybe they meant everything. They walked in silence at first, their steps muted by the soft forest floor. The morning was cool, with sunlight slipping through the tree canopy in thin, golden shafts. It could have been a peaceful hike under any other circumstances. Dan paused every so often to pin flyers to trail posts or branches, hoping someone, anyone, might see one. "GPS shows a fork ahead," Mike said, checking his device. We'll take the right path. It's a quieter section, harder to reach. Dan adjusted his pack and nodded. These trips had become a kind of rhythm, the weight on his shoulders, the steady pace, the silence between them. A routine that felt sacred now. As they moved deeper, the trail thinned. Roots twisted underfoot, leaves carpeted the ground. The light dimmed, replaced by the damp smell of moss and bark. The woods pressed in. "Watch your step," Mike said, pointing ahead. "This part gets slick." Dan braced himself with his walking stick, easing through a sloping patch of trail. The trees were denser here, the canopy thicker. A quiet heaviness settled over them. "You really think someone could have brought Robbie out this far?" Dan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mike stopped to survey the undergrowth. If someone wanted to be sure he wouldn't be found quickly, yeah. This is the kind of place you'd choose. No patrols, no hikers, just wilderness. Dan swallowed hard. The image was almost too painful. His son, scared and alone in this vast forest. But still, he kept walking, because turning back wasn't an option. But Dan forced himself to stay focused. He had to, for Robbie. Eyes scanning every patch of ground, ears tuned to the slightest sound, he moved slowly through the underbrush. The trail had almost vanished now, forcing them to carve their own path through dense foliage. "Let's spread out a little," Mike called out. "You take that side of the clearing. I'll go this way. Look for anything unusual. Disturbed ground, torn fabric, anything that doesn't belong." Dan nodded and veered right, eyes sweeping the forest floor. Every snapped twig, every gust of wind rustling leaves made his heart leap, only to fall again when it turned out to be nothing. He was so locked in on the ground that he didn't realize the terrain had dipped ahead. His foot slipped on a slick patch of wet leaves, and suddenly he was sliding toward a ravine, scrambling to stop himself. "Mike!" he shouted, panic tightening his voice. Mike rushed over, but something strange happened. He didn't reach out right away. For just a moment he stood there, staring down at Dan, unmoving. "Mike!" Dan shouted again, more urgently. Only then did Mike extend his hand and pull him up to safety. Breathing hard, Dan collapsed on solid ground. "That was way too close. Why'd you freeze like that? I thought you were going to let me fall." Mike's expression didn't give anything away. "Sorry," he said. "Guess I panicked for a second. Haven't had to do that in a long time. Reflexes aren't what they used to be." Dan nodded, but the words didn't sit right. That hadn't looked like panic. It had looked like hesitation, as if Mike was weighing something. "We should head back," Mike said abruptly, brushing off his pants. "My chest's feeling a little tight. Don't want to push it." Dan didn't argue. He knew about Mike's condition and didn't want to risk anything. "Of course, we can always come back." But as they hiked back, something felt off. Mike was moving fast, almost effortlessly. No sign of chest pain. He even led the way uphill without stopping once. And he'd gone quiet. Too quiet. Dan noticed the shift, and it made his unease deepen. The parking lot came into view faster than expected. The way back always felt shorter. As they neared the car, Mike suddenly stopped. "Just remembered," he said. "I've got to pick up Millie from school." Dan frowned. "Doesn't she usually ride the bus?" "I promised her I'd watch her baseball practice today," Mike replied. "She's getting really into it, just like I did." "That's great," Dan said, though the thought of another kid falling in love with the sport Robbie adored stung a little. "We can pick this up next week," Mike added. Dan nodded. "Yeah, next week." At the car, Dan reached for the cooler. "You want something?" he asked, flipping open the lid. "No," Mike said quickly. Too quickly. "You sure?" Dan pressed, surprised. Mike always looked forward to a cold drink after a hike. "I'm good," Mike replied firmly. Dan grabbed a soda for himself, more aware than ever of the tension coming off his friend in waves. This wasn't the Mike he knew, the one who was always calm, composed. This Mike seemed unsettled. After tossing the gear into the trunk, they both climbed in. Before starting the engine, Mike pulled the inhaler from his pocket and looked at it briefly, as if unsure what to do with it. "I can hold on to that for you," Dan offered, "or put it in the glove box." "No," Mike said quickly, placing it in the coin holder near the driver's seat instead. That too felt strange. Why not just accept the help, or put it somewhere safer? These little things, they were stacking up. Not enough to point to anything clear, but enough to make Dan's gut twist. As Mike started the car and they pulled away from the forest, Dan stared out the window. Questions ran through his mind, questions he wasn't ready to ask, suspicions he didn't want to admit, and a growing unease about the man he had trusted above all others to help find his son. The drive to Millie's school passed in silence. Mike kept his eyes locked on the road. Dan sat quietly, lost in thought. When they arrived, Millie was already waiting outside, backpack slung over one shoulder. She ran up to the car, beaming when she spotted Dan. "Uncle Dan," she chirped as she climbed into the back seat. 12 years old, just like Robbie, with her father's determined eyes and her late mother's gentle smile. "Did you go looking for Robbie again today?" she asked, leaning forward between the seats. "We did," Dan said warmly, trying to push the tension aside. He'd always had a soft spot for Millie. "How was school?" he asked. "Boring," she said, flopping back into her seat. "But we've got a math test tomorrow. I'm totally going to crush it." She peeked forward again. "Dad, can I still go to baseball?" "Practice after lunch," Millie chirped from the back seat. "Coach Trent said we're working on stealing bases today, but don't worry. I promise I won't be too tired to study for the math test tonight." Dan smiled faintly, but his eyes were on Mike, whose hands were gripping the steering wheel just a little too tight. When Millie repeated her question, Mike startled, as if he'd forgotten she was even in the car. "Yes," he said flatly. "You can go." "Thanks, Dad." She leaned back, content, and launched into a full recap of her day. Cafeteria drama, homework overload, who said what during recess. Dan nodded along, asking the right questions, giving the right smiles, but his mind was racing. The inhaler, the hesitation at the ravine, the way Mike had gone silent afterward. As Millie's monologue wound down, Dan took a chance, a test. "So, Millie," he said casually, "your dad told me you've been having some asthma trouble lately." She blinked. "What?" Mike quickly cut in. "Yeah, sweetie. Remember? That flu turned into bronchitis, then asthma. Been, 3 months now?" Millie looked uncertain. "Oh, yeah, I guess so." She hesitated, then added, "The doctor gave me some inhaler thingy." Dan watched her closely. "He said you like using it cold." Her brow creased. "Cold?" she repeated. "Well, I guess that would feel nice." It was clear she was trying to follow along with something she hadn't been told, something that didn't make sense to her. "Kids," Mike chuckled, a bit too loudly. "They say the funniest things." The car pulled into Mike's driveway, and Dan suddenly felt cold, and not because of the autumn air. He didn't need more proof. Millie's reactions said it all. The inhaler in the cooler wasn't hers. They all got out, and Mike turned to his daughter. "Go on, kiddo. Lunch and homework before practice." "Okay," she said, dashing inside. Mike turned to Dan. "I'll be in the garage if you need anything. Help yourself to whatever's in the fridge." Dan nodded. "Actually, I think I'll head home for now. Thanks for today." "You feeling okay?" Mike asked, casual. "You seemed a little off after that slip in the woods." "I'm fine," Dan replied. "Are you okay? Your chest?" Mike gave a practiced shrug. "I'm good, just a little winded." As he turned toward the garage, Dan started toward his car. But before he could get in, he heard a voice behind him. "Uncle Dan!" Millie had come running out of the house, breathless. "Remember that baseball card you promised me? I think you forgot." Dan blinked. "Baseball card? You said I could have one of the special ones, from the famous team." She dropped her voice. "Don't tell Dad I reminded you. He gets mad when I'm not polite." Dan chuckled softly. "You're right. I did promise. Let me go home and grab it, okay? I'll bring it to you before practice." "Really? You promise?" "I promise," he said, tousling her hair. "Now get back inside and do your homework like your dad said." She grinned and ran back inside, her joy momentarily pulling Dan out of his troubled thoughts. But the second he started driving, the questions returned in full force. Mike, his friend, his rock through all of this, had stood by him for 9 long months. And yet, something wasn't right. The inconsistencies were growing, building into something Dan could no longer dismiss. The inhaler, the delay on the slope, the sudden mention of a gun, Millie's confusion. Each one alone meant little, but together, they whispered something Dan didn't want to believe. He pulled into his driveway, the house silent and unchanged. Robbie's absence lived in every corner. Dan drifted into his son's room, trophies still on the shelf, comics stacked neatly, the bed left unmade like Robbie might walk back in any moment. He walked to the bookshelf and opened the binder where Robbie had kept his most treasured baseball cards. Carefully, Dan picked the one Millie had asked for, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. This time, he wouldn't forget. Driving back to Mike's street, Dan turned the corner just in time to see Mike's car speeding out of the driveway and disappearing down the road. Dan blinked. It was too early for Millie's practice, and Mike hadn't said a word about leaving. Acting on instinct, Dan grabbed his phone and called. It rang once, then went to voicemail. That wasn't like Mike. Dan parked in front of the house and knocked on the door. To his surprise, Millie answered, but the light in her face from earlier was gone. She looked smaller somehow, quieter, and in her hand was an inhaler. Not the blue-capped one he'd found earlier. This one was pink, a dry powder type, a completely different model. "Uncle Dan," she said softly, "I came to give you the card." "Millie," Dan said, keeping his tone gentle, "I saw your dad leaving. Is everything okay?" She nodded slowly. "He said something." "She said you had to leave suddenly," Dan said, watching Millie's face. "Work emergency." Millie shrugged. "That's what he told me. Something about the workshop." Dan nodded slowly, but his mind was already racing. Just an hour ago, Mike hadn't seemed in any rush to get back to work, and now, suddenly, he was racing out of the driveway like something couldn't wait. "I brought you this," Dan said, pulling the small plastic case from his pocket. "The card I promised." Millie's face lit up. "Really? Thank you." She took the card delicately, examining it like it was gold. "This is awesome, Uncle Dan." Dan smiled, then let his eyes drift to the pink inhaler in her hand. "I noticed you've got an inhaler. Is that for your asthma?" "Yeah," she said, holding it up. "Doctor gave it to me after I got sick at school. They said it's for my bronchitis and allergies." Dan nodded. "Tough break. So, you never keep it cold, right? Like in a cooler or anything?" Millie blinked. "No, why would I do that? It's always in my backpack." She tilted her head slightly. "Why do you keep asking about it?" Dan forced a casual smile. "Just curious. Your dad mentioned you like it cold, and it got me wondering." Millie frowned. "That's weird. I've never said that to him." Dan's heart thudded. It was a small detail, but it was real, tangible, confirming something he had hoped wasn't true. "You need a ride to practice?" he asked gently. Millie shook her head. "Nah, I've got a test tomorrow, so I'm staying in to study. Dan hesitated. You sure? I don't mind staying until your dad gets back. I'm 12, she said with a grin. And you know Dad has the house rigged up like Fort Knox. She wasn't wrong. Mike had every kind of sensor, lock, and camera money could buy, habits left over from his NYPD days. Okay, Dan said, still uneasy, but lock up behind me, and call if you need anything. I will, she promised. Thanks again for the card. The door closed. Dan heard the deadbolt click into place. He walked to his car slowly, every step heavy with suspicion. The inhaler in the cooler didn't belong to Millie. She had a completely different type. Mike had lied about the medication, about her preferences, about why he left. And now, he wasn't answering his phone. Dan sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. There was only one place Mike could have gone, his woodworking studio just outside town. 20 minutes later, Dan pulled up to the large barn-like structure that served as Mike's workshop. His personal car was parked outside. The work van, the one he always used for deliveries, was backed into the loading area, its rear doors open. Dan stepped out and approached the building, the smell of sawdust and varnish thick in the air. "Mike," he called, voice echoing. "You here?" No answer, but there was movement in the back. Dan walked forward slowly, weaving between benches and tools. Then he saw it. Mike, crouched at the rear of the shop, struggling to load something heavy into the van. It took Dan a moment to register what he was seeing. A coffin, unpolished, unfinished, rough wood, wrong shape. "Mike?" Dan said again, his voice sharper now. Mike spun around, startled, and Dan saw it instantly, the panic in his eyes. His hand twitched toward his pocket. Dan knew what was there. "Dan," Mike said, his voice higher than usual. "What? What are you doing here?" "I saw you leaving," Dan said calmly, stepping closer. "Thought I'd check in. Make sure you were okay." Mike's eyes darted toward the van. "Just working. Rush order. Client needs this by tomorrow." Dan nodded slowly. "That why you took off without saying anything?" "I was in a hurry. That's all." Mike's tone was strained. "Why are you here, really?" Dan kept his voice even. "I came to drop off the card I promised Millie. We talked for a bit. Nice girl. Smart. Said her inhaler's always in her backpack." Mike stiffened. "Said she's never kept it cold. Doesn't even use the type I found in your cooler." Dan took another step forward. "And she never told you she liked it chilled. That was you, Mike. That story came from you." Mike's hand shifted again, toward the pocket. "You went to my house and questioned my daughter about her health?" Dan didn't back down. "I think you're hiding something. You hesitated in the forest. You brought a gun, something you've never done before. You've been off all day." "You don't know what you're talking about," Mike growled, but the calm exterior had cracked. The voice that had once reassured Dan during endless, hopeless nights was now trembling, fraying under pressure. Dan stared him down. "That coffin isn't for a client, is it?" Silence. Just the faint hum of a table saw somewhere in the dark behind them. And Mike, standing perfectly still, one hand clenched, the other still far too close to the weapon in his jacket. Dan's eyes locked on the crude wooden coffin, a sickening realization forming in the pit of his stomach. "Why did you rush out today, Mike?" he asked slowly. "What are you hiding in that van? And why lie about Millie's inhaler?" Mike's hand slipped from his pocket, now holding a gun, its barrel trained directly on Dan. "Don't push it," Mike warned, voice shaking. "I don't want to do this." Fear gripped Dan's chest, cold and sharp, but it didn't silence him. "The inhaler in your cooler," he said evenly. "It's Robbie's, isn't it?" Mike didn't reply, but his silence said everything. Dan's eyes moved to the coffin. "Open it," he demanded. "I want to see." "It's for a client," Mike snapped, his finger twitching on the trigger. "Walk away, Dan." "We were best friends," Dan said, voice cracking. "You won't shoot me. Just open it." For a second, it seemed Mike might lower the gun. Then, he pulled the trigger. Dan lunged to the side as the shot rang out, the bullet slamming into a workbench. Instinct kicked in. He hit Mike's arm, sending the weapon spinning across the floor. They both dove for it, but Dan got there first, tackling Mike hard. The two men tumbled to the ground, grappling in the dust, years of trust dissolving into raw desperation. "Why?" Dan shouted, struggling to pin him. "Where's my son?" Mike's face twisted with fury and something else. Envy. "I always envied you," he spat. "I wanted a son, not a daughter. My wife, she cheated. While I was working night shifts, saving people who didn't deserve to be saved." He lunged, grabbing a heavy woodworking tool from the bench and swinging wildly. Dan barely dodged. The tool smashed into a pile of boards with a crash. "That doesn't explain why you took my son," Dan growled, circling. Mike's voice broke into a yell. "I wanted someone to carry my name, someone to coach, to shape. I should have had a son, not a daughter who idolizes you." He charged again, weapon raised high. Dan sidestepped. Mike slammed into the bench, off balance. "Tell me," Dan shouted. "Robbie, he's in the coffin, isn't he? You were going to move him after I started asking questions." Mike let out a bitter laugh. "I should have let you fall in that ravine. I should have pushed you." He came at Dan again, swinging with deadly force. This time, the tool grazed Dan's shoulder. Pain seared through him, but his hand hit something on the floor. The gun, one motion, one shot. Dan raised the weapon and fired into the ceiling. A warning. The blast echoed through the room. "Drop it!" he shouted. "Drop it now, Mike!" Mike hesitated, then roared and lunged again. Dan fired low. The bullet hit Mike's leg, sending him crashing to the floor, screaming. The tool clattered beside him. Dan kicked it away and kept the gun trained on him. Backing toward the workshop phone, he grabbed the receiver and punched 911 with his free hand. "This is Dan Hartman," he said urgently. "I need police and medical at Lakater Woodworking Studio. I've shot a man. I believe he kidnapped my son 9 months ago." He gave the address, then turned back to Mike, who was writhing on the floor, clutching his wound, face pale with rage and pain. "Where is he?" Dan demanded. "Where's my son?" No answer. Dan moved to the van. Still holding the gun in one hand, he used the other to lift the lid of the coffin. His breath caught. Inside, Robbie, pale, still, but breathing, chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. Alive, drugged, but alive. Dan dropped to his knees. "Robbie," he whispered, brushing the boy's hair from his face. "I found you." In the distance, sirens screamed closer, growing louder. Dan stayed beside the coffin, protecting it, protecting him, as squad cars pulled into the lot and officers poured into the workshop, weapons drawn. Dan stood slowly, raising his hands. The gun hung from one finger. "He's in the coffin," he called to the first officer. "My son. He's alive but sedated. And that man on the floor, he's the one who took him." "Put the weapon down, sir," the officer commanded. Dan obeyed, lowering it gently to the floor. "Please, check on my son first." The officer nodded, gesturing to his team. Several ran to the van, while others cuffed Mike, who was still writhing on the floor. "He's breathing," one officer confirmed. "Call the medics. Now!" Seconds later, paramedics stormed in. They moved quickly, lifting Robbie from the crude coffin and checking vitals, oxygen, responsiveness. Dan hovered, barely breathing himself. "How is he?" he asked. "Stable," a paramedic said. "Very sedated, but heart rate and breathing are good. He needs a hospital. Fast." Meanwhile, another team tended to Mike, dressing his wound, loading him onto a stretcher. A detective approached. "Mr. Hartman, I'm Detective Reynolds. I'll need a quick statement." Dan nodded, never taking his eyes off the stretcher carrying his son. "His name is Mike Lakater. He was my best friend, my son's coach, a former NYPD officer." His voice broke. "He kidnapped my boy. He kidnapped my son from the Gardner ball field 9 months ago," Dan said, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Today, I found Robbie's asthma inhaler in Mike's cooler. That's what tipped me off. When I came to confront him, he was loading a wooden coffin into his van. He pulled a gun. We struggled. I shot him in self-defense." Detective Reynolds nodded grimly, taking notes. "And the boy in the coffin, you're sure it's your son?" "Yes, Robert Hartman, missing for 9 months." "We'll need a full statement soon," the detective said. "But right now, you should go with your son to the hospital. Officer Daniels will escort you." As paramedics wheeled Robbie toward the exit, something struck Dan. He turned quickly to the detective. "Wait, Mike has a daughter, Millie. She's 12. She's at home, alone." "We'll dispatch child services immediately," the detective promised. "Where does she live?" Dan gave Mike's address, then hesitated. "I'd like to be there when you speak to her. She knows me. She trusts me. This is going to destroy her." The detective nodded. "We'll make it happen. Go be with your son. We'll keep you updated." Dan climbed into the ambulance, taking a seat beside Robbie's stretcher. He gently took his son's hand in his own, unwilling to let go after 9 agonizing months. No matter what lay ahead, he was here now, and Robbie was alive. At the hospital, Robbie was rushed into emergency care. Dan waited in a small room outside, pacing until a doctor finally appeared. "Mr. Hartman, I'm Dr. Lana. Your son is stable and responding. He was sedated with multiple substances, but we've begun treatment. He's dehydrated and undernourished, but there are no life-threatening injuries. We'll keep him overnight for observation." Tears welled in Dan's eyes. "Can I see him?" "In just a few minutes. He came to briefly and asked for you." While waiting, Dan's phone rang. It was Detective Reynolds. CPS had arrived at Mike's house and was with Millie. If Dan still wanted to be present, a patrol car could take him now and bring him back afterward. Dan paused, torn, but the nurse confirmed Robbie would sleep for several hours. "I'll go," he said quietly. The drive to the Lakater home was silent. Dan stared out the window, still trying to process how one day had upended everything. When they arrived, a CPS worker was seated with Millie in the living room. Police officers moved quietly through the home. Millie jumped up as soon as she saw Dan. "Uncle Dan, what's going on? Why are the police here? Where's my dad?" Dan sat down gently beside her. He took her small hands in his and, with the CPS worker's help, explained as gently as he could. Her father had done something very wrong. He had taken Robbie. He had kept him hidden. Millie stared at him, confused. Then the confusion turned to tears. "No, not my dad. He wouldn't. I never saw him with Robbie. Never." "I'm so sorry, Millie," Dan whispered, holding her as she cried. "I know it's hard to believe. I know it doesn't make sense." Eventually, when she'd calmed a little, the CPS worker explained she would need to stay with a foster family until things were sorted. "No," Millie said firmly, clinging to Dan. "Please. I want to stay with Uncle Dan. Please don't make me go somewhere else." Dan turned to the worker. "Is that possible? I've known her since she was born. I want to take care of her. At least for now." The worker hesitated. "It's not typical, but considering the circumstances, if she's comfortable and you're willing, we can request emergency placement. You'll need a background check and a home visit, and I have to be clear, it's not guaranteed." "I understand," Dan said. "Whatever it takes." Millie looked up at him, eyes red and pleading. "Please, don't leave me alone. I just want to be with you. And Robbie." Dan swallowed the lump in his throat. "You will be, I promise. And yes, Robbie's okay. He's at the hospital, and you can visit once he's ready." Millie nodded quietly. After completing initial paperwork and helping Millie pack a few essentials, they were driven back to the hospital together. Officers escorted them to a private waiting room where Detective Reynolds was already waiting. Dan gave his full statement, recounting everything: the cooler, the inhaler, the confrontation. The detective listened carefully. "Mike is in stable condition after surgery. He's under guard. He hasn't said a word about what happened." Then the detective added something that made Dan's skin crawl. "We found surveillance equipment in his workshop, hidden cameras, recordings. He had a concealed, soundproof room beneath the floor. That's where he kept your son. That's why no one ever heard a thing." Dan felt the floor shift beneath him. "Can I see the footage?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The detective exhaled and glanced toward Millie before pulling Dan aside. "We can't show you the footage here," he said gently, "but you can view it at the station." Dan swallowed hard. "What's in it? Please, I need to know." The detective's voice lowered. "It's disturbing, Mr. Hartman. It shows your son being forced to train in a basement, repeating drills for hours. Lacader punishes him for making mistakes, forces him to call him Dad. When Robbie refuses..." He paused, struggling with the weight of his words. There were also instances of coercion, verbal, physical. And during asthma attacks, Lacader withheld his inhaler, wouldn't give it back until Robbie said he belonged to him. Dan closed his eyes. A wave of nausea and horror passed through him. He had imagined nightmares, but nothing like this. "We've got enough evidence to make sure he never walks free again," the detective said firmly. Dan's voice cracked. "How did he even take Robbie? That day? There were people everywhere." The detective checked his notes. "We pieced it together through witness timelines and some partial admissions. After the game, when most parents were chatting or packing up, Lacader volunteered to clean up the gear. He asked Robbie to stay and help load equipment." Dan felt the blood drain from his face. "That's when he used a chloroform-soaked cloth. Once Robbie was unconscious, he placed him inside a large equipment bag, zipped it, rolled it across the field to his truck." Dan barely whispered, "And no one noticed." Everyone had seen him haul big gear bags before. Nothing seemed unusual. He even said goodbye to you while wheeling the bag to his car. Dan sat heavily. "All this time, I thought he was in the locker room, and I was standing 20 feet away while my best friend was kidnapping my son." The detective nodded solemnly. He planned it with the precision of someone trained to hide things, someone who knew how not to raise alarms, and then he inserted himself into the search, volunteered for every search party, especially in places far from town. Dan said nothing, but his mind screamed. He knew. He always knew. Once the statement was complete, Dan was allowed to return to Robbie's hospital room. Millie waited with a social worker in the family lounge. Dan walked in slowly. Robbie lay in bed, impossibly small under the white sheets, his skin pale but calm. Machines hummed quietly. His chest rose and fell. Dan sat down and reached for his son's hand. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, his voice catching. "You're safe now. I found you." Robbie stirred. His eyelids fluttered open. "Dad?" he whispered, voice faint. Dan leaned in, eyes full of tears. "Yeah, I'm here. I never stopped looking." A tear slid down Robbie's cheek. "You found me." "I always would," Dan said softly. "Always." Robbie's eyes closed again, the medication pulling him back into sleep. But his fingers clutched Dan's hand and didn't let go. Dan sat there in silence, watching his son breathe, barely able to believe the nightmare was ending. A quiet knock interrupted the stillness. Millie stood in the doorway, unsure, the social worker behind her. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice small. Dan nodded. "Of course." He's sleeping, but you can sit with us. She walked over slowly, eyes wide as she saw Robbie's fragile form. Is he going to be okay? Yes, Dan said. It'll take time, but he's strong, and he's not alone. Millie sat across from him, tears rising again. I'm so sorry for what my dad did, she whispered. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Dan reached across the bed, taking her hand. You're not responsible for this, Millie. Not one bit. This was his doing, not yours. They sat in silence, Dan, Millie, and the sleeping Robbie. The room still felt like a place between worlds, between the horror that was and the healing that could be. Dan looked at Millie. Her whole world had been shattered in one day. She too was a victim of her father's choices, of his lies. And in that moment, Dan made a quiet promise. He would protect her, just as he would protect Robbie. She wouldn't face this alone. After a while, he gently asked, You hungry? We can get something from the cafeteria. Millie nodded. Okay. As they walked to the door, she paused, glancing back at Robbie. Will he be okay while we're gone? Dan smiled softly. Yeah, the nurses are watching him, and we'll be back soon. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the elevator. The road ahead would be long. For Robbie, for Millie, for him. There would be therapy, courtrooms, tough conversations. But for the first time in 9 months, there was light. His son was alive, and that was enough to face whatever came next.